We've gone live. Just thought I'd let you know. Do you want to introduce yourself, or shall I introduce you in a minute?
No, I'm happy to introduce myself. So I'm Dr. Katy Turton. I work as a university teacher at the University of the Highlands and Islands. I've written 3 books which I'm going to talk to you about today. I've written a book on Lenin's sisters, I've written a book on family networks in the Russian Revolutionary Movement, and most recently I've written a novel, Blackbird's Song. And I'm going to talk about these different writing projects and what I've learned about women's role in the Russian Revolution. So, as I said, I started out life looking at Lenin's family, and you shouldn't worry if you've never heard of Lenin's family, because he's so often portrayed as a solitary revolutionary, probably most iconically in the statues you see of him standing arms outstretched. That's one's outside the Finland station in St. Petersburg. But you'll have seen all sorts of versions of portrayals of Lenin, and his family life, the presence of his sisters in his life have largely disappeared from view. But as a PhD student, I inevitably wanted to make sure that I refound the sisters who'd been lost in history and look at their own contribution to the revolution. You can see on this slide that Lenin in fact had a huge family. He had 5 siblings. And you can also see that he wasn't actually the eldest, which again might be an assumption you would make. In fact, he had 2 older siblings, Anna and Alexander, and it was those 2 siblings who went off to St. Petersburg and first became involved in the revolutionary movement. Alexander famously was hanged for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Alexander III. So then it was left to Anna to go back to the family and tell them about her experiences in the revolutionary movement and draw them in her footsteps. So Vladimir and Olga join next, followed by Dmitri and Maria. Now, poor Olga died at the age of 20, so she exits the scene quite soon. But the rest of the Ulyanov family then worked together as a mini network of revolutionaries within the Bolshevik Party. They corresponded with each other, they supported each other in prison and in exile, and they all contributed to the actions and activities of the Bolshevik Party. All of them also experienced prison and exile, and it's at these times you see the value of having siblings on the outside while others are on the inside, to keep their spirits up, to help improve their situation. After the revolution, Lenin's sisters went on to have roles in the Bolshevik government. Anna went to work for the Department for the Protection of Childhood, and then in the History of the Party's department. And there she helped oversee the writing of what would become the Soviet historical canon. Maria worked for the state newspaper Pravda and was a close associate of Bukharin. So having completed this work, I had begun to see in my research that Lenin's family was by no means unique, and that in fact lots of revolutionaries in the revolutionary movement had family networks around them, supporting them. Women were involved as sisters, as mothers, and in order to really understand how the underground movement worked, understanding those family networks was going to be key. And so my next project became this family networks in the Russian Revolutionary Movement. And I looked at all sorts of different relationships and how they helped. So let's start with sympathetic siblings then. So here are Lydia and Vera Figner. So they went off to Switzerland to study medicine because they weren't allowed to study it in Russia. And while there, they joined the Friche Circle, which was a radical group of Russian women. And having completed their studies, they went back to Russia and were founding members of Land and Liberty, one of the populist organizations, the early conurbations of socialists in Russia. And they, having established their own revolutionary careers, they drew in their younger sister, Yevgenia, as well. And what you find is that siblings throughout the revolutionary movement are key sources of information, corresponding with each other. They quite often go into exile together to support each other. And these kinds of relationships are well known to the police as well. Now, another way people were drawn into the revolutionary movement was through marriage. It wasn't unusual for one spouse to be already in the revolutionary movement and having married to draw in their own spouse. And it could work both ways. Wives drew in husbands, husbands drew in wives. And also, since lots of the revolutionary circles were made up of young students, quite often they found love together in the revolutionary circles. So here's a nice example of Inessa and Alexander Armand. So Inessa was in fact adopted into the Armand family and first fell in love with the older brother. Now he was a liberal in outlook and they both participated in philanthropic events, endeavours and events. But their marriage gradually broke down and Inessa ended up marrying Alexander's younger brother, Vladimir. Now she had children with both of these men, 4 with her first husband and a 5th with her second. But what's really fascinating is that Alexander and Inessa remained supportive friends. So when Inessa was off on Bolshevik party missions, he would look after the children. And for example, when she was imprisoned, it was her husband who petitioned the authorities to have her prison sentence mitigated. Now, throughout the movement, you find husband and wife teams, if you like, working together. So he'll be writing the revolutionary pamphlets and she'll be running a safe house, or they'll both be working on a printing press together. And one of the really fascinating things you see is that because spouses were so useful, where real spouses couldn't be found, fake fiancés and fake spouses were set up. So if you wanted to set up a revolutionary party cell, for example, one way you did it was you posed as a married couple so that you would look respectable and innocent, and then you would be free to set up your illegal printing press, start plotting a terrorist attack, and so on. And similarly, spouses were one of the few people who could visit a prisoner while they were imprisoned or go into exile with them. So where real spouses didn't exist, revolutionary parties arranged for fake fiancés to go in and visit prisoners who were on their own and suffering. In fact, one revolutionary remembers that occasionally it happened that a prisoner was visited by 2 or 3 different fiancés, and then this awkward situation occurred with the authorities. It looks like they're committing bigamy as well. Now, where there were adult children in the revolutionary movement, you also find that their parents were drawn into revolutionary activities as well. Quite often it was their widowed mothers, and these mothers were formidable. So Lenin's mother and mother-in-law were both entirely sort of on the ball. They knew exactly what Lenin and his wife were up to, and lots of mothers became involved in the revolutionary movement. In particular, they sussed out that the police rarely suspected an older woman and never stopped her and searched her, so they were very good at transporting illegal literature. There's a lovely story about one mother of a Bolshevik, and she's got her basket of illegal literature. She gets caught up in a student demonstration, cordoned off by the police, and instead of turning tail and trying to run, she goes up to the nearest police officer and says she's just a little old lady trying to get to the train, and the police officers let her through, and off she goes with her basket of illegal literature. So parents were quite often active and useful to the movement. Now, where there were marriages, there were also children. Now, quite famously, there are lots of examples of revolutionary women who gave up their children so that they could continue with their revolutionary careers. But lots of parents also kept their children with them. Now, obviously, one of the first things they had to do was train their children not to give away what was going on. And parents used various mechanisms to do that, including one mother who spread hot mustard on her daughter's tongue when she thought she was being indiscreet. But children were an excellent disguise for revolutionary activities, and there are lots of anecdotes of bombs being hidden under children's beds or illegal literature being put in children's toys. There's even an example of parents strapping bullet cartridges to their children, giving them brand new coats to wear, and then crossing town with the children carrying the bullets so that they weren't caught. And children often ended up going into exile with their parents as well. One of the key aspects of the punishment of exile, of course, was emotional isolation. So if your spouse and or your children could follow you into exile and live with you, it was a really important way that people could maintain their sense of normality and get the emotional support they needed to survive exile. And there's lots of photos like this of revolutionaries with their children while in exile. There's Sverdlov with his son in Siberia in 1915 alongside Stalin and Kamenev. It's such a common sight that it even makes its way into artwork. There's Yaroshenko's Life Goes On. Now, the presence of children in exile could also help with escapes from exile. Trotsky famously went into exile with his wife and 2 children, and he said that the guards were relatively lax at keeping an eye on him because they thought he would never abandon his wife and children in exile. But his wife, who was also a revolutionary, said, "Go, you're needed by the movement," and so off he went, and she covered his absence for as long as possible. Of course, she might have regretted that because in the end he abandoned her and took up with another woman in Europe, having escaped, but that's another story. So, just to round this off then, how we should understand the movement is less thinking about the pictures of Lenin and this idea of the sort of the solitary male revolutionary, but rather this kind of scene. This is Lenin and his fellow party members crossing Stockholm on their way back to Russia in 1917 after the revolution. And you can see here that it's a very much a family affair. So there's Lenin, there's his wife Krupskaya, there's Inessa Armand, and behind them there's Zinoviev with his wife, and he's holding his son's hand. And on the sealed train going back into Russia, there were multiple children, there were brothers and sisters, there were husbands and wives. So the revolutionary movement very much depended on these kinship networks in order to function. So, having written these 2 books as a lecturer, I then took a career break to raise my family, and during that time I turned my hand to fiction writing, and I decided to work with what I knew, the revolution, and my understanding of the importance of family networks to write Blackbird's song. So I was determined to have family relationships at front and centre. So I start my story in 1903, and it's set around the 1905 revolution, the first Russian Revolution. This is my favourite church in St. Petersburg. It's the Church of Christ the Saviour on the Spilled Blood. So it was built to commemorate Alexander II's assassination. It juts out into the canals so that the cobblestones where he lay can be surrounded by the church. But in 1903, this was the scene. It was still being built. And I love that it was captured in a historical photograph. What did Russia look like in 1903 then? Well, you can see there Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg, these wide boulevards and a street not out of place with any other European city. Russia's been modernising, there's a huge industrialisation, the Trans-Siberian Railway's been built, and it's even part of the development of modern art as well. There's Natalia Goncharova's Fruit from 1900. Now, with industrialisation, of course, came great inequality, and workers in St. Petersburg and the other main cities worked in difficult, dangerous conditions for long hours over many days of the week. They lived in barracks which were poorly constructed and overcrowded. And as workers are experiencing poverty, of course, we have the other side as well. We've got not only the Russian aristocracy, but a growing wealthy class of businessmen and industrialists who can enjoy things like the Café de Paris, Café Cuba, and so on, and these rich settings for their socialising. So we open our scene with Anna starting her time at the Bestuzhev Higher Women's Courses. In Russia, at this point, women weren't allowed to study at university, but they were allowed to do university equivalent courses, these higher courses. So she enrolls and starts attending class at the Bestuzhev building. And you can see here what the class would have looked like. It's while here that she meets Rosa and then Rosa's twin, Boris. Now, Boris and Rosa are part of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. So unlike the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, who are particularly focused on the working class, the Socialist Revolutionaries see the importance of the peasantry to the revolution. Their communal way of life will be part of the new socialist regime. And also, unlike the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, the Socialist Revolutionaries have a combat organisation, or a terrorist wing. It's led by this man here, Azev, who later in the decade turned out to be, in fact, also a secret police agent in a sort of scandalous discovery for the revolutionaries. So I thought that in my novel I really wanted to explore the dilemmas and ethics and troubles that surround using violent means to enact political campaigns. And along the way we meet several terrorists, including Anastasia Vitsenko, who killed a general in November 1905. We also are aware of the assassination of the Minister of the Interior, von Pleve, as well, and you see the remains of his carriage after a bomb was thrown. So what brings about the revolution in 1905 then, which is at the heart of my novel? So aside the general inequality of the Russian regime and growing discontent at the autocratic system, in 1904 Russia goes to war with Japan. And although there's an expectation that Russia will be able to win this war easily, in fact Japan puts up a strong defence and defeats Russia roundly. Fighting this war also puts great strain on the workers, it puts strain on the economy, and so on. So as tensions mount then, a plan is hatched by this chap, Father Gapon, to stage a workers' protest. The plan is that they will march on the Winter Palace and petition the Tsar for economic reforms, but also political ones, so the granting of the vote and the establishment of a legislative assembly. Now, the Tsar is not, in fact, in St. Petersburg and refuses to meet with the protest, and instead the workers are met with soldiers who shoot them down in the street. And this sends shockwaves across the whole of Russia and unites the Russian people in protest. So, railway workers, newspapers, school children, ballerinas, they all go out in a big, huge national strike that goes across the whole country. And as the urban protests continue, the peasants also take up the revolution. They start rebelling themselves, they attack local landowners, they loot and plunder grain, and the whole country descends into turmoil. So naturally, I send my characters off into the countryside down to Saratov, and specifically to the little town of Belanda there, so that they can see, so we can see through my novel the peasant uprising. So you can see here these various photographs of Belanda. We've got the flat plains. There's Belanda Station, which has its own small branch off the Trans-Siberian Railway. And there are the Cossacks. They're highly effective as suppressors of urban unrest, but they're also sent out to the countryside to restore order there as well. Now, the turmoil of 1905 puts enough pressure on the Tsar to persuade him to issue reforms, and he issues the manifesto in October the 17th, 1905, which establishes the vote for men and also sets up a legislative assembly. You can see it here, the celebrations of the manifesto captured by Ilya Repin. For the socialists, this doesn't go far enough, of course, and for the next 2 years, there's sort of an all-out battle between the authorities and the peasants and the workers who are still protesting, until finally the Tsar re-establishes order. And for the socialists who continue to fight, of course, there are the harsh consequences. So in my novel, we see inside the House of Preliminary Detention, one of the prisons in St. Petersburg. We see Buterka prison in Moscow, which is still a prison today. And we see what it was like for revolutionaries to be sent off into exile. And lots of them were sent all the way to the east, out to Akatui. And here, en route there, we meet the Shesterka, the 6. So these are 6 revolutionary terrorist women. Spiridonova is probably the most famous there at the front, as they make their celebrated journey out to exile. And facing the cost of these terrorist actions and the revolution is sort of the final big question of my novel. So I thought if you would indulge me, I would do a short reading from my book as well. This is taken from the very heart of my book. You can see it's right in the middle. This is the main crisis, the main turning point for my characters. So Boris, Rosa and Anna are now fully fledged members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and they've decided to join Gapon's workers' protest. So they're heading off to the workers' protest on 9th of January 1905. I don't know how he has done it when we have not. He has who knows what links to the police, and he's a priest to boot. Why do they trust him? Boris complained again. We've worked for years with the peasants, the workers. We've never been able to call out thousands of people like this. He gestured towards the crowd moving towards the Samsonevsky Bridge. He knew he had said this several times already. Indeed, he'd been interested in talking of little else all morning, but the answers continued to evade him. His assembly of Russian factory and plant workers has only been going for 18 months. I've been an activist for nearly 6 years. It was galling that this new revolutionary force had arisen independently of the existing underground networks, and that he was not at the centre of it. Was it possible he'd been in the wrong party all along? Maybe the workers don't like the look of you, Rosa answered flippantly, as she skipped along with excitement beside him. It was a happy sight, but he scowled at her anyway. This was a serious matter. Then even Anna chipped in. I don't know, they're both tall, dark and good-looking. Gapon's beard is longer, though. Rosa snorted with laughter, while Boris tried to hide his own amusement. What's got into you two? We could be going to our deaths. Nonsense, Borya. They began to cross the bridge, the timbers creaking ominously under the many feet. That would be typical, Boris thought, if we all perished in a bridge collapse before we even reached the march. I don't accept your pessimism, said Rosa, hopping onto the safety of Bolshaya Dvoryanskaya Street, which led on to Troitsky Square. Look at the crowd. The end of Bolshaya Dvoryanskaya framed a picture of multitudes before them. Women's colourful shawl-covered heads were bright spots among the dark shapkas of the men, while reverent pictures of the Tsar and icons were held aloft up and down the street. Who could fail to be affected by this sight? The soldiers won't be able to bring themselves to fire, said Rosa, earnest and certain. Gapon has achieved miracles already. You said so yourself. Maybe we'll all end up hearing the Tsar announce reform. Boris, said Rosa, in what he hoped was a quelling sort of way, just as Anna replied, do you really think so? Yes, why not? And if it all comes to naught, Boris demanded, trying to bring these dreamers back to earth. Then you'll have to start growing your hair long too, Rosa retorted. Oh, be quiet, Boris began, now irritated. But at that moment they entered the square and he realised they'd only been seeing a tiny portion of the crowd. It was magnificent. Boris was provoked by all the religious and royal symbols which adorned the banners across the whole square, but he could not deny that the reds, purples and golds of the placards gave the demonstration an impressive air. There was a loud hum of voices, the occasional highly pitched shout of a child and bursts of laughter. There was even singing, of different hymns coming from both left and right. He felt a most unexpected rush of patriotic love for his fellow Russians and swallowed hard. Without a word, all three of them drew together, Boris giving an arm to each of his girls, and they joined the crowd. There was plenty of room between the various groups of people, a sign of the relaxed atmosphere, but in amongst them Boris felt warmed and safe, even as frosty breaths puffed out into the air all around him. Now a standard rose up at the head of the crowd which showed the emblem of the assembly. Gapon was leading the Narva district workers towards the Winter Palace from the south, but some of his deputies were here north of the river. Someone began the hymn, Save us, O Lord, thy people, and as more and more took up the melody, it approached in a wave of sounds towards them. The effect was profound, for this was a hymn everyone had known since childhood, and the crowd became one. It should be something revolutionary, the Varshavyanka March, or at least the Internationale, Boris complained, but beside him Anna shrugged and joined in. There were tears in her eyes, for goodness sake. Now Rosa was singing with gusto. A space opened up in front of them and it was time to set off. Something was happening up ahead though. The crowd was slowing down again. This might simply have been the effect of reaching the Troitsky Bridge, which would take them across the Neva to the Winter Palace, but more ominously the singing stopped at the front of the procession and died away down the ranks. Why are we stopping? Rosa asked, straining to look up ahead, but too short to see beyond the first few people in front of her. Only a little taller than Rosa, Boris could not see anything either, but he didn't need to. There must be soldiers up ahead, he said. He had predicted this, but now that it was happening could summon no triumph or satisfaction. In point of fact, he was disgusted, and if he were completely honest, afraid. Those fiends, he said, and let go of Anna and Rosa, his hands forming into fists. The crowd began to sing the national anthem. Surely they won't fire, whispered Anna. Surely they can see this is a loyal crowd. Of course they're going to fire, didn't I tell you? Boris snapped, sick to the stomach. The singing was carrying on, and the crowd showed no sign of dispersing. Indeed, they were drawing more tightly together. Nevertheless, people were glancing about uneasily, perhaps seeking reassurance from those standing with them, or looking for routes of escape. The crowd sang the final verse of the anthem and fell silent. A child nearby began to cry. Then an eerie moment of stillness stretched on and on. The guns opened fire. The whole crowd shied as one. They fire into the air first, said Boris urgently. The next time they won't. Let's... The guns fired again and the screaming began. The crowd shattered into movement, some charging towards the soldiers and the rest seeking cover. For a second, Boris's body tensed, more than ready to join those surging forward. Some were bound to find a way to cross the ice and reach the palace. He knew, however, that he could not leave his sister and Anna to fend for themselves. The soldiers would be beating and shooting today, not making arrests. He tried to grab for both of them, found Anna's hand and began shoving through the crowd towards a side street. "Come on, Rosa," he roared over his shoulder, not seeing his sister, but hoping she was behind him. He heard Anna shriek, "I can't see her," but didn't stop and pulled Anna along, elbowing people out of the way and gripping her hand so tightly he could feel her bones grind. He reached a side street and began to run down it, the press of people not so tight here. Anna was dragging on him, shouting his name. "Boris, stop. Rosa isn't here. We've lost her. We have to go back." He spun round, letting his fear ignite into anger. "We can't. We'll be killed." Over Anna's shoulder he could see horses in amongst a seething crowd. The screaming was terrifying. He made himself look Anna in the face. She was white with fear, her wide eyes full of accusation. "We can't," he repeated. "Rosa would want us to get away." "You would want her to save herself, wouldn't you? Well, that is what she will be doing right now." "She will be," he repeated to himself. Anna gathered herself to start protesting again, but Boris prevented her from doing so by setting off and yanking her along with him. When the fight went out of her, he loosened his hold on her hand, but did not release it altogether. People jostled roughly past them on both sides, and panic coursed through the air. Boris heard the thud of hooves on hard-packed snow and pulled Anna down an alley to his right. He threw her down behind some wooden pallets and crouched down with her. Anna vomited. Boris spared her no attention, but kept watch instead. When he finally checked on her, irritated beyond words by her gasping breath, he saw that there was a body right beside them, covered in blood. "He must have been shot," Anna whispered. "He's not breathing." A shout of outrage escaped Boris, and heedless of the risk of being seen by soldiers, he hauled Anna up and carried on along the alley to the other end. He decided they would not stop again until they were safe indoors, and gritting his teeth, he led Anna back onto the street.
Okay.
Thank you.
I often wonder how I would respond in situations. I've often thought that.
Well, just going out. I mean, they just going out knowing that they might have to face down soldiers in a protest. It's and then what to do when the shooting does finally start. It's always a real concern, isn't it? How you would respond.
Exactly. I was just thinking of all the demonstrations I've been on in the past. You know, and there must be such psychological studies about how people are whooped up into things that in normal circumstances they wouldn't. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And then certainly it does really have a sort of snowball effect where, in fact, that the shooting of these workers is only the beginning, and it sort of galvanises everyone to unite and go out and protest, and really does genuinely spark, as I say, it becomes a national protest. The press print stories criticising the Tsar. There's the national railway strike. Newspapers stop publishing. So it really wreaks a whirlwind.
It's like the whole thing. Like you can be brave for yourself. I've always said this. In various situations, you can be brave for yourself, but when it impacts upon family members, that's when I think a lot of people. You know that thing about getting their kids to smuggle stuff. I'm like.
Yes, well, they just used any mechanism at their disposal.
I get it, but I'm just like.
I mean, obviously the sources are slightly skewed as well, because lots of those children then went on to become Bolsheviks themselves, to become part of the government. So when they did publish their memoirs, they sort of speak very proudly about being involved and how they were willing participants. Occasionally you find memoirs that are less complimentary, smeared on her tongue. Remembers sort of being had all these different movements building up, and 1905 itself is quite similar to 1917. You know, there's a war going on that's going badly. It's put huge pressure on the economy. There's a bad harvest which affects all the peasantry. So there's the same sort of economic and military crisis going on in 1905. The key difference is that when the workers and the peasants do go out in 1905, the Tsar can still rely on his soldiers to suppress them. And obviously the difference in 1917 is that almost as soon as people are out on the street in huge numbers, the soldiers mutiny as well, and that's the real turning point. That's when the Tsar can't then continue.
Were they led in that mutiny in the 1970s?
The soldiers, well,
Or was
again,
it independent individuals?
well, it's a combination. I mean, the Bolsheviks in particular had been very good at infiltrating the imperial army while it's at the front, while it's in barracks in the cities. So there's plenty of work being done in that respect. There's also deep discontent about the way the war is running, and discontent towards the officers as well. So different rebellions have different motivations, and of course the final straw, of course, is the soldiers being sent out to shoot on the crowds, which contain huge numbers of women as well. So these are the same people they are currently going to war to defend, and they're having to shoot at them to try and get them under order. And so so there's lots of different things that come together to make the soldiers mutiny.
Mm-hmm. So where were the populace in that? Were they? Because I'm going back to that. When were the populace around? Were they 1870s?
Yeah. So
that's what I remember. God, blimey.
So yes, you're right. We start out with land and liberty, and then which splits into the Black Repartition and the People's Will. And the People's Will is the terrorist wing that assassinates Alexander II. And then out of the ashes of the People's Will and the Black Repartition comes the Socialist Revolutionaries. So they've got that kind of the peasant credentials. And then, having seen that in the end actually the assassination of Alexander II was not effective in any way, we get the emergence of people who are much more swayed by Marxism and the argument that a workers' revolution towards communism is an inevitability. It's the next stage of human progress. Mm-hmm. And so you get the emergence of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which is the one that splits into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks with Lenin. So he rejects the terrorism of his brother and becomes a Social Democrat and then Bolshevik. The revolutionary scene in Russia looks very much like a tree with more and more branches, if you see what I mean, and attempts to unify in key moments like 1905 and then back into splits and so on.
What made you choose to study this in the first place, and then?
I was an English and history student at Aberdeen University, and we just had a couple of incredibly inspirational Russian historians there, and just hearing them speak about the Russian history. It was mainly 19th century Russian history that we did until fourth year when we did the revolution itself, and I was just hooked. To me it was the bit of history that I enjoyed studying the most. So then I went off to Strathclyde University and learned Russian, and then I went to Glasgow to do my PhD, and then that was it. I carried on my career that way. So, but I think there's something about the history that around the revolution is one of big ideas, and particularly of idealism. It's people wanting to build a better world, and even if they use methods that are hard to condone, like revolutionary violence and terror, but at the same time the hopefulness and desire to build a better world is quite, it's very easy to draw people in thinking about those kinds of questions. And
would it interest you to write one now that is kind of set either now or in the future, or is that not something that you'd, if you think of like how incorporating the internet and all that kind of?
Yeah, well, it's one of the fascinating questions, is that, how I really have always found fascinating the sort of how you conduct a clandestine revolutionary organisation when there isn't these kinds of resources to use. And so I love all the stuff about them writing letters in code, or using milk or lemon juice, for example, to write letters, and how they hide them and get them sent across Russia. I mean, they're covering vast distances of Russia as well as Europe, to where there are lots of exiles as well. Whether I could write a future one, I think I'm too much of a historian. I like to have the sources around me to know that I'm sort of on strong foundations of what I'm writing. I can't quite imagine sort of inventing a world, but who knows? You never know when an inspiration might strike, and you might get a new idea. So
it's amazing how they transported all those theories and that galvanised people.
Yeah. Yes, it's fascinating again on the sort of the distribution of revolutionary literature. They send them all out send revolutionary literature to the front, the soldiers in World War One. They do all sorts of things, sort of, you know, write it on very thin paper. They hide it inside book covers to send it into Russia. There's people who, you know, rewrite them by hand. There's people who retype them by hand. So it's been hugely painstaking to get, you know, even a few thousand pamphlets out to the workers, and yet the whole of Russia's flooded with them, really.
I wonder if it works on Chinese whispers as well, so you get the wrong messages passed on.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, there's certainly an argument to be made that, you know, that particularly as the revolution approaches, you know, people see what they think is important in the revolutionary pamphlets. You know, that they believe, you know, they begin to believe that, you know, the Bolsheviks will give them everything they've ever hoped for, and so on. So there are misconceptions about what the revolutionary regime will actually look like, and yes, the hopes pinned onto the revolution are vast and varied.
I mean, this is like a sweeping comment, but did the people in the peasant group, for want of a better term, were they receptive to the idea? Do you think, you know, sometimes people come in with these grandiose ideas, don't they, to liberate people, and it's a bit, I hate using the term, but it's a bit like that white saviour thing.
Yeah, so
did these people actually want saving? For what of a better, I'm not trying to be
you're
strange.
You're quite right. There is that. So revolutionaries had quite a sort of checkered experience of going out to the countryside. So famously in the 1870s there was the Going to the People movement, where lots of idealistic youngsters from St. Petersburg and Moscow went out to the countryside to try and spread the revolutionary word. And they were met with hostility and suspicion. They were often reported to the police. Hundreds of them were arrested and put on trial. And so the revolutionaries came up with a new tactic, which was they basically worked, you know, as teachers, as doctors, amongst the peasantry to talk to them about ideas. And what you see, as you say, is that actually the peasants take quite a lot of agency for themselves. So, and you see them participating actively in the political processes as they're opened up to them. So throughout the course of 1905, yes, they're doing the looting and the burning and the sacking of estates, but they're also organising into unions and political organisations. They're sending candidates off to the Duma, the new legislative assembly. And yeah, there is a sort of fundamental mismatch where, above all, after the revolution in 1917, the peasants expect to get the land, but what the Bolsheviks and the government are offering them is the nationalisation of land, and they want to impose a new form of socialist farming and agriculture on the peasantry. And there's an absolute clash there, where the peasants don't want to be told what to do. They don't want to be folded into, and you see the huge clash with Stalin over collectivization. So you're absolutely right that what the peasants expect to get from the revolution, which is agency and land of their own, is not what's on offer. It's in fact the nationalisation of the land, and that means the government control of it. So.
I'm always interested in that kind of white saviour come riding in and telling people, telling them what they need, you know, what we need to make things better for you, but always engaging with those people.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah, and the peasants had effectively been politicised, especially in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So they were capable of expressing their desires through political channels, you know, in the political system. And so yes, they're very adept at defending their position.
Good.
Well, there's no questions coming up on here.
Oh no, maybe I've answered them all already.
I think you've answered them all, so it's been absolutely great, very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm very glad that everyone was able to tune in from afar, because
yes,
that's lovely.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for having me.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.